Yes, hello. More precisely, I want to speak about transforming APL+Win workspaces into dialog workspaces. What do I mean by this? I have a long time project migrating from APL to dialog. It's ongoing for years, among other things, because I'm alone and my main work is on the business side. That means I have very, very low developer capacities for migrating things. My migration is based on a workspace management framework. I've spoken about this in Germany and it can be found online. I will give a brief summary of it today. And I'm targeting a better APL system than the old one. That means I'm not trying to copy APL+Win workspaces. I'm trying to create true dialog workspaces using specific dialog features. And also I combined it with some corrections, overhauling of the old code. And for all these reasons, it's ongoing for years and it's very slowly moving. In the first part, I will give a brief summary of the framework I use for the workspace management. And the main part consists of structural changes I do to objects during migration and coding changes. Coming to the first part, framework, the old APL+Win system had no framework. It was just saving workspaces. So any framework will be better than the old one. The one I'm using is based on text files, simply using link. I had built it up. Morten sat next to me when link was starting and showed me how to do this. The versioning is done through Tortoise. It could be Git. We have Tortoise in our company. And of course, on this side of the code, code and version management are completely separate objects. I use one repository for each workspace. I have something like 9 important workspaces. And I have an official checkout as a code publication for other developers to use it. They do not use it. I have one guy now who has based a workspace on my utilities. I use different workspace build modes. I work on the working copy, of course, and I use 2 sessions in parallel, usually, both starting on the working copy and not on the repository. And I have one interpreter for coding and one for debugging simultaneously open. And I work on the one side and debug on the other side. This is my usual work setup. The framework contains also a test infrastructure. I use a kind of unit tests. On the APL side, I had nothing similar. On the APL+Win side, I had nothing of the kind. The results I have are usually too long to write them explicitly down. Therefore, I transform them into text using array notation, and I save them in a database. That happens to be DB2 on the mainframe. So building the tests mean I design them first, inspect the results manually until I'm happy with them, and then I fix the targets in the database, and the actual test is the comparison between target results and actual results. And it gets also, it's also being documented in DB2 for internal audit purposes. It's the formality of auditing them is more important than the testing itself, almost. Deployment of workspace means always building the workspace from the head of the repository, the head revision, running all tests, and then saving the workspace in a target folder. And that's all the summary to the framework. It works good, and it's definitely better than the no framework of the APL+Win system. Coming to the structural changes, they concern high-level changes on the workspace level and changes on the object level. On the workspace level, each and every workspace has to be pressed into the new framework structure in order to cooperate with the others. sources, the sources of each workspace that belong to this workspace come usually from a working copy. Foreign code, for example, base utilities imported from another workspace, come usually from the repository. And objects, there are no objects directly under the root. There are only namespaces, and they are structured like this. Each workspace gets a main namespace that distinguishes this workspace from all the others. Each workspace has a build namespace that contains the building instructions and the test cases. Each one has a playground namespace that it is not part of the deployment. It exists only on the level of coding and debugging, but not deployment. And foreign code is imported under the main namespace name of the workspace it is coming from. So the only thing I need is one specific name for each workspace to distinguish them. And there are also some names reserved for temporary or global objects. Okay. The contents one level down the main namespace are also namespaces. This means in APL+Win I had a flat structure. In Dyalog I have 2 levels of namespaces, and under this second level of namespaces the functions and operators. In APL+Win the distinction of objects was through name prefixes, and in Dyalog it's through the main namespace name. So this was the easy part of the migration because I had used this distinction. The result in APL+Win was sometimes rather chaotic. In Dyalog I think it's clear cut, and the collections of objects do not get too big. I do not have namespaces with 300 functions or something like this. This is a typical structure. The workspace concerned with actuarial data has 1 level of namespaces under it. Some basic utilities are imported under another main namespace name, and some specific health utilities under the third one. And names, here were the old prefixes used in APL+Win, and the new structure is better and clearer using namespaces. In the first line, you can also see some additional work, some modularisation done on a function that was too big and was splitted into 3 or 4 parts. Cooperation between workspaces on the level of code and data. In APL+Win, I always copied objects manually when it was necessary, and kept track in my mind what I have to do where and when. In Dyalog, it's been done automatically during workspace build, and it's fixed at deployment. Data exchange, I always used component files for it, and I still do. The interesting thing is streamlining the interfaces. I can use APL+Win component files also as a bridge between migrated and not yet migrated workspaces. This is the usual deployment structure. The code of the own code of the workspace comes always from the head revision in the repository. The foreign code may come from a fixed revision in case I changed something in the base utilities and had not yet time to change the own code of the workspace accordingly, if, for example, there is another syntax needed. This is the workspace concerned with actuarial data. The main result is a component file with actuarial data, and the workspace Rückstellung concerned with a balance sheet should use them, but it is not as yet migrated. So I can call APL+Win through a COM as a COM object, load the old utilities function under APL+Win, and create the component file, the APL+Win component file with actuarial data, so the old workspace can still live and work. Okay, coming now to objects. I always had a relatively fixed structure of objects. There not much was changed. I just documented a structure with a header having some fixed settings like migration level 1, activation of error handling directly after the header, a fixed form and order of controlling parameters and arguments, main part, and in each function, a cleanup section where errors are ignored and maybe a database connection is closed or something else is done. On this level, not much changed. The only thing, the header is the most significant change. In APL+Win, it was one line, and it was sometimes very, very long, going into the thousands of characters. In Dyalog, it has become multiline, and it's not long anymore. I always try to reflect the structure of the object in the header, but of course, when you have 2,000 characters, it becomes almost impossible. In Dyalog, it's much easier. Namespaces were missing in APL+Win. I use them now for main data or for collecting similar parameters in a namespace that is passed to another object, reducing the size of the header significantly or dramatically. And I use the convention for passing namespaces as a reference when they are only to be used, and as a copy when they are to be modified. For example, this might have been an old APL+Win function with something like 300 characters here in between and 18 parameters needed for the function. Under Dyalog, it has become a structure with a multi-line header, and there are only 10 parameters. Those are two namespaces that are copied because they will be modified in this workspace. Those are the main data that were semi-global under APL+Win, and now they are localized. This is a namespace that will not be changed and is passed as a parameter. And the running protocol is a special case. It will be changed because something will be added to the running protocol, but because it's a window, I cannot pass it as a copy because then I would have two windows. Okay, I always tried to make objects functional with local variables, but in APL+Win I had some problems. Sometimes the amount of data or the number of variables was too high, and I had to use some ugly semi-global solutions. Exceptions, I always had exceptions, and I still have exceptions where I want to save objects globally, but I do not need the ugly solutions under Dyalog anymore. If something needs to be saved globally, then I use specific paths, like this, for example. This function, global names, I can ask it, where should I save a range object of Excel globally? And it tells me this would be the right path to save it globally. Okay, and this was all about the object, the structural changes. I think, again, they have become better during migration. Coming now to new methods and a few things about OOP. As I said, I'm using namespaces. I'm also using them locally in functions, not only for passing arguments. I started using Dfns. In APL+Win, sometimes some algorithms were too small for a traditional function, and in Dyalog, it's okay to have them as separate objects. I also started using them inline. For example, this was typically a trim algorithm that was used at 1,000 places in APL+Win. In Dyalog, it has become a base utility with some additional options and is a Dfn. Or this is the build-up of a nested Dfn as a preparation for grouped operations. Or this one is a code that will check GUI input and see if the data type is right. Those are inline or on-the-fly Dfns I started to use. With trains, I'm not familiar as yet. I'm an older developer in years of age and in years of development. I'm trying to get used to them, and very few have appeared in the code. This is an example where some averages, reducing and scanning, are prepared again for grouped operations, but not much more of trains is in the code at the moment. New primitives is one of the kernel differences during migration. I've started, or I use key for central algorithms. I use the new capabilities of index off for matrices that were missing in APL+Win. I started using the iota underbar to make code more readable. I started using at the basic level to make simple replacements. And power operator at the most basic level as a condition for conditional application. I think Morten does not approve of the usage for conditional application. It depends. And I'm using modified assignment, not for everything, but for example, for building up a long SQL code statements. This is an example that was the kernel of an old algorithm that counted the representative of equivalence classes, and of course it has been replaced by a call to key, or the same thing with grouped summing, again key. This was a longer algorithm that did the indexing of rows of matrices in APL+Win, and now the primitive does this. Those are the examples where I use the iota underbar to reduce the 6 tokens to 2, for example, in loops, in conditional loops. This is an example where possible line endings are replaced by blanks in 2 SQL statements to make them better comparable. It's a basic level, but it uses at. And this is the conditional application of the power operator. At the end of a function in cleanup, I want to close a database connection, but if and only if the database connection is local to the function, meaning that it has been opened in this function. Okay, the same thing as with primitives goes for system functions. They are new functions for native files in Dyalog. There is this new function for datetimes, and of course regular expressions. Of course, this goes beyond a new system function. It's a new way of thinking about patterns, and using them is a process. I'm at the beginning of this process. I'm using them at the basic level. This is an example. I had to use the so-called file scripting object in APL+Win. This is the way it was created in APL+Win, and those were methods it offered, and they have been replaced by nexist or ndelete or whatever. This was a typical sequence reading in a small protocol and splitting it into lines, and it has been replaced by a call to nget. Or this one is let's go one back. This is a thing where data, I use now the quad DT, and in the old APL+Win code, there were own written functions and algorithms to doing the same thing. This is regular expressions on a basic level, replacing some constants, or here simplifying SQL code, 2 versions of SQL code to make it comparable. Okay. Now, last point, object-oriented programming. I have running protocols in my functions that stay green as long as everything is okay, and get red if there is a problem and a crash. In APL+Win, this was only a Windows form variant. In Dyalog, it has become a proper class. It's passed as a reference, and I added some new methods that were obviously missing on the APL+Win side. For example, whenever I wanted to protocol the message what's up, I needed also the timestamp, and I compacted this into a new method, or I sometimes need the reaction of the user, abort or proceed, and I made a new method. This parameter is a timeout parameter. It's needed in order to facilitate automated tests on the function that uses this method. And in this case, it says in German, after 3 seconds, I decided to proceed because you said nothing. GUIs, I have only schematic interaction with the user, with my 3 or 4 users, they are not more. In the company, I need a main GUI with buttons that calls main functions, and a parameter GUI to set parameters. I added some functionalities during migration, and I use the namespace syntax for GUIs. This is a part where objects are created. I do not use the quad W sheaf paradigm. Do not bother reading the German text. This is a schematic main GUI. The thing is, it is only described abstractly in the workspace where it resides, and there is a base utility that does all the interaction. And the same goes for parameter GUIs with grids or whatever. They are only described schematically in their own workspace, and there is a base utility for handling them. Last point, databases and Excel. In APL+Win, there were also Windows objects. In Dyalog, now they are in namespaces. I also use the direct access to namespace syntax for them. In APL+Win, some tricks were used. The syntax was complicated. There was something called redirectional syntax that had to be used. One very important point, some new functionalities to Excel were added by a new developer. Now I'm not alone anymore. And I hope that in a few years a colleague of me will come also to some conferences. This was an example with tricky syntax for setting the standard font and the standard font size in Excel. I needed 5 lines in APL+Win, and in Dyalog it can be written in 1 line using the namespace syntax. So those were the points. Coding changes, what does the future hold? The basic utilities and the infrastructure are almost completely migrated. Now the simulations proper are on the horizon, the important applications. I do also some other things while migrating, like changing the error handling, modularisation, and such things. It's still a long time project, but I think that the resulting Dyalog workspaces are already significantly better than the APL+Win workspaces. And therefore, I think that the target set at the beginning is already achieved. And that was all. Thank you.